Thanks for hopping on, everyone, today. It's 11 o'clock Central. Thanks for joining us, whether you're on Mountain Time in the East Coast or international. For those of you who don't know us, my name is Ted Cross, and I'm the VP of Product here at Novi Labs. And alongside, I have Brandon Myers, who's our head of research. Brandon will be conducting the talk today, covering the recent SM acquisition of XCL Resources and the potential that we see in the Uinta Basin. Brandon is Novi's head of research. He's been an absolute pleasure to work with. He has a previous background in uh, equity research, play research, et cetera, with stops at the investment bank Peters up in Calgary and Wood Mackenzie down in Houston. Has been through some different entrepreneurial hijinks over the years and also a geologist as well. So eminently qualified to talk to us today. If you do have any questions or comments as the webinar goes in, please, you can either put those in the chat and we will see them, or you can enter them into the Q&A section, and we'll answer those as we can. But for now, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Brandon, who will walk you through his presentation and take any questions that you have.
So, yeah, we'll jump straight in. Before we kind of jump into the actual Uinta-based stuff, I wanted to kind of set the stage, I guess, just on like where the Permian is and kind of why we think this deal makes sense right now. So for anyone who missed this came from our Midland inventory paper from Urtec this year. And effectively, what you're looking at, the graph on the left is per foot oil productivity over time. And you'll notice the trend here, which basically is from roughly 2017 to Q4 2020, we saw an increasing productivity trend. And then through a combination of, call it rock quality decay, high grading, and parent-child interaction, we saw an inflection point, and now we're kind of in an environment where per foot productivity is dropping on average year over year. And effectively, that leads us to the graph on the right, which is our modeled inventory by break-even tranche. And the way to kind of read this is at $70 to $80 a barrel, we are of the opinion that there is roughly 7.5 to 9.5 years of remaining inventory. Okay, and so I started here with the Midland for a reason, and it's effectively this. We, as an industry, are approaching the halfway point for inventory exhaustion in the Midland. And so the question that I'll pose to the audience is, effectively, if we're at that point and operators need to start looking for inventory, what competes? And what comes next. And so I'll draw your attention to kind of three recent acquisitions. Obviously, SMXCL making an entry into the Uinta Basin. Second one, I think it caught my eye, was Chevron's decision to buy Hess for the exposure to Guyana, obviously offshore, and even potentially Rockies. And the third one was EOG, company that's obviously famous for organic inventory expansion, but you know, the take-home point for me with them was an operator with the war chest and the cash to do a big splashy Permian M&A chose to stealthily build a Utica position instead. And so this just ties up to the header on this graph, which is, I think we went through an era where the narrative was, you know, test everything in every basin. A lot of stuff didn't work. Then it was an era of like, you know, you better be a pure play operator or the investment community won't touch you. And now we're kind of back to realizing that there's not an infinite amount of inventory in the Permian. And so it's a question of who can dust off the exploration team and actually develop a new play and bring it to the market. And they're obviously always going to be a niche for companies that can do that. And so that kind of leads us into the acquisition itself. So 30,000 foot view, we break the basin up into three fairways. The green is the Eocene oil fairway. That's the one I'm sure everyone's most familiar with. That's where most of the horizontal development is. I'll be talking exclusively about the green polygon today. And then maybe just as a quick, like kind of cool piece of trivia or something maybe that you might not know, EOG actually had a kind of an interesting Blackhawk formation gas play in that red polygon, kind of in that 2015 to 2018 era. And it was like, I think it was about 3,000 wells they were looking at drilling, and obviously gas prices didn't support that. But the point being that a lot of operators have kind of picked over the basin in different areas over the years. But yeah, we've largely settled on the Eocene fairway as kind of what's going to be the focus going forward. The second thing that'll draw your attention to is just the little mini map there. There's an expanded version of this later, but the point is this: that red box at the northern end of the oil fairway is the location of XCL's asset, and the basin kind of grades from shallow to deep as you go south to north. And so when we're looking at that north stuff, and this will be important later, that's really the deep, more unconventional part of the basin. And then the final thing, just while we're looking at the bird's eye view, in my mind, there were four things that historically hung the basin up from being taken seriously by both investors and operators. And those kind of range from there was some opacity around demand for waxy crude, and like, was there demand? What did the demand look like? Would it stay strong? What would differentials look like? Two, what did the egress look like? Can you get that waxy crude to market? Three, can operators go from single well to pad to cube development and still maintain those nice oily EURs that kind of compete with the Permian? And then four, can they deal with the high LOE and operating costs in the basin? And this map on the left doesn't do it justice, but if you did a terrain map, you'd see that the area is actually quite mountainous. And historically, that came with some high LOE. So anyways, all of that to just kind of say that we're of the opinion that a lot of this stuff has largely been dealt with, and these issues are kind of receding to an extent. Zooming in a little bit, I'll spare everybody the Friday morning geology lesson. Just conceptually, starting from the Wasatch, we're looking at kind of lower stand water levels. So lots of fluvial influx, lots of geologic heterogeneity. So wells vary laterally in the Wasatch. As you get into the Uteland Butte, that's your high stand. The waters come up quite a bit. That's your deeper intervals, deeper water intervals, and they're deposited in more of an unconventional sense. So out of these three intervals, the Uteland Butte is the one where it's most resembles a traditional unconventional play that you'd see in other basins. And then finally, up at the Castle Peak, the water level drops again, and you get back into kind of a mixed conventional, unconventional interval with lots of fluvial influx. You've got sand again. You've got lots of geologic heterogeneity. So think Wasatch, Castle Peak, lots of geologic mapping, lots of heterogeneity. Uteland Butte, think a little closer to kind of mowing the grass the way that you maybe would in the Eagleford, etc. So I'll leave that there. Unsurprisingly, given what I just said, most of the wells historically were landed in the Lower Green River, which contains the Uteland Butte, and most of the Lower Green River wells were landed in the Uteland Butte itself. So roughly about 50% by our calculations of 78% of the wells were Uteland Butte. And again, it's just because as far as unconventional development goes, that was the one that probably most resembled other unconventional plays. But that's not to say that there's not potential or even good production today in the Castle Peak or even in the Wasatch itself. So moving on to the, I guess, bit more of the actual deal metrics itself. What does the deal do for SM on a kind of operations basis? And I think we kind of nailed it here. At the end of the day, they go from roughly about 10th to 7th in this small to mid cap peer group that we've shown on the left on an operated horizontal lower 48 oil basis. So they kind of resemble Coterra or Apache now, and in terms of who they're approaching in terms of that metric. On the actual per foot productivity and operational metrics side itself, we're looking at two graphs here. On the left is per foot oil productivity in the Uinta Basin, This is a little bit of a larger bucket here. We've got all formations bucketed together. So this will just be basin-wide average by operator. And on the right, showing that same graph, which is per foot productivity in the Midland, and also per pound productivity, per pound of sand productivity in the Midland across those vintages. So I'll take a quick second here to kind of hammer this point home. And it really is this. XCL's asset, as far as we're concerned, is exceptional, especially across the Uteland Butte. And you can see it on a per foot metric. On a per foot metric in the Midland, SM is also ranked quite highly. I think we have them fifth here. And this is across all operators, so we didn't narrow down this peer group. The only caveat is SM does not screen as well on a per pound of sand basis. So to an extent, the Midland success, has at least partially something to do with maybe what we would consider a slight overcapitalization in terms of proppant per foot. And all of that is to say nothing negative, but essentially just hammer home the point that we think SM's asset is good in the Midland, but we think the XCL asset is exceptional. And we really wanted to paint that picture that, and this theme will come up as I go through the deck. We thoroughly believe that this is accretive to SM's rock quality across the lower 48. And we want to hammer that point home. Okay, and that kind of leads us to this. So I'm going to be really, really careful how I kind of dance through these next two slides. So bear with me. This slide and the next slide pair together. Do not make a conclusion until I've kind of made my point on the second slide. So just to show you what we're looking at, the map on the left is all of our SM modeled Midland inventory. So we actually model everything out, if you're unfamiliar with this, stick by stick. And we're in the process of doing this across all of North America. They are ranked by machine learning derived rock quality tier. And so the dark green is the high quality rock, and the dark red is kind of the lower quality rock. And I will just caveat this with these are ranked across formation. So a low quality, lower Sprayberry shale would have to compete against like Wolfcamp A in this example. So it's not just who has good and bad Wolfcamp A. It also matters which intervals you're exposed to. And you can kind of see that graph on the right here, which just compares versus operators. So we've just thrown Civitas and Apache in here. And the take-home point on the surface would be that SM, to an extent, has some lower exposure to the best kind of Q1, Q2, Tier 1, Tier 2 rock versus peers. Okay, so here's the caveat. When you break SM's remaining inventory down in our model by formation, there's kind of a bit of a story within the story. And the way that I'll go through this is effectively one, the first caveat is it is partially like what we saw in the previous graph is partially due to the way we model inventory. And so if there is a well test or there is production in an interval in that area, an operator is ascribed that inventory. And the reason I bring that up is SM, especially their northeast acreage, sits right in our Wolfcamp D fairway. And so, for example, to give you a contrast to that, a Western Midland operator like Conoco it would not be in our Wolfcamp D fairway just because there's very few Wolfcamp D tests over there. And I just bring that up because at the end of the day, the Wolfcamp D in that area does to an extent kind of weigh down the average on remaining rock quality. And so to kind of give you the opposite of that point, and the take home here is if you just look at the Wolfcamp A, the B, the stuff that's actually being drilled today, we estimate that SM could essentially just purely drill Tier 1, Tier 2 rock for a little over 5 years straight if they so chose to and high grade that way. And historically, the operator's not done that. But again, just to kind of hammer home the point that like, I don't want to paint the picture that they have an immediate inventory issue, and they don't. What I want to paint a picture of is that they have good assets in the Midland, but we think it's accretive in the Uinta, and they're getting better assets. So we just wanted to paint that picture, and I'll kind of leave that there. And maybe just as a final point is just when we're doing this rock quality analysis, It is rock quality at some time equals 0. And so we have a full separate analysis for overfill and co-development effects, but this is purely just on day one, not inclusive of depressurization. What did the rock quality look like? Okay. So now moving into the actual XCL asset itself, what we are showing here is on the left, a feature importance or a Sharpnado. And essentially what your takeaway should be is at the bottom of that graph is your less important variables. And at the top of that graph is your most important variables, according to the machine learning model. And this is true in the Castle Peak, and it's true in the Uinta Butte as well. That as far as geology goes, it tends to be pore pressure, depth, TOC, that lead to better production, with some caveats that the Castle Peak, again, has some geologic heterogeneity, and there's some thickness that you maybe have to account for. But again, the point being here, if you're in that high pressure zone, we think that generally leads to better rock quality. And if you look at the map on the right, we're showing the orange outline is elevated pressure or the onset of overpressure. And then that dark red line, just pulled straight from SM's acquisition deck, is what they kind of define as the kind of higher overpressure. And the takeaway again is like XCL, the dark gray sticks on that map. Their wells and their acreage sit right in that high overpressure zone. And so, yeah, if the one liner there is essentially high pressure tends to lead to good rock, XCL sits right in the center of that high pressure zone. Okay, here's another slide that I'm going to be very careful about how I describe. What we are showing here on the left is a distribution of the machine learning derived rock quality for XCL and Ovintiv in the Uinta Butte on the drilled wells only. Okay, so this is not remaining inventory. This is just showing what did the rock quality of each operator's drilled wells look like. And it gives us a proxy of what the acreage position looks like in general, with the caveat that Ovintiv has drilled more wells than XCL. So they're a little further down the development curve. And the point here is essentially this. To date, XCL has drilled the highest quality rock in the Uinta Butte, compared to anyone. And in this case, we've compared them to Ovintiv just because Ovintiv is a basin leader. And I'm going to finish tying this point off with this. Both of these operators have above average rock quality in this interval. And it certainly wasn't to paint the picture that Ovintiv's rock quality was bad here. It's also exceptional. Again, it's just that XCL to date, the wells they have drilled have the highest rock quality so far. Slightly different picture in the Castle Peak member. And if you kind of remember back to the log from earlier, Castle Peak, more heterogeneity, a little more sand influence, more of a conventional, unconventional hybrid play. And the two things I'll draw your attention to here is, to date, we estimate that Ovintiv and XCL have had quite similar drilled rock quality, with Ovintiv actually being just slightly higher in this case. And if you look at the map on the right, again, ranked by machine learning derived rock quality, dark green is the best, with the red and the yellows kind of getting that moderate to lower quality rock. Both Ovintiv and XCL are kind of sitting in that moderate range. And if you go to the southeast, where Ovintiv still has a bit of acreage, but you generally are getting into the Uinta Wax company's acreage. So just to give you an idea, two different plays, different trends. Uinta Butte, they're in the sweet spot. In the Castle Peak, they're in kind of that moderate rock quality spot. In terms of basin evolution on completion design, what we're looking at on the left is, and it's a bit of a small graph, but kind of clockwise from the top left, you've got Uinta, Uinta Butte, Williston, Delaware, Midland. And this graph is showing you diminishing returns of completion design over time. And so basically, where does the model suggest adding more proppant does increasingly less and less? And the Uinta Butte kind of hits that metric, or that inflection point, at about 2,000 pounds per foot. And the two takeaways here are this. both XCL and Ovintiv have hit both above and below that in recent years. So they've already come up the learning curve to an extent to hit that point. But the basin average itself actually for the first time ever hit that in 2024. So XCL Ovintiv, we think they're further up the learning curve. They've kind of figured out this diminishing returns on the proppant loading. Basin average just arrived there now. And so really just to kind of hammer home the point that it is still a nascent basin. It's relatively new. There's still lots of learning going on, I think is the takeaway. Okay, so in terms of actual production itself, looking at a comp to Midland Wolfcamp A average on the left, and then a table showing Midland Williston average Green River and XCL average Green River as well. And the kind of two take-home points are this. One, you can see that we think the average Uinta Lower Green River well outcompetes both the Midland Wolfcamp A average and Williston on oil IP30, on oil EUR, on IP30 per foot, and oil EUR per foot. And then in addition to that, XCL outcompetes the average on top of that. So that's the first point. And then we'll just follow it up with this, which is essentially as spacing has dropped from 1,500 to 1,000 to 500 feet, that's in zone interwell spacing I'm talking about. We have seen Uinta oil EORs maintain that 550 to 600,000 barrel range. And so they're still tracking above the Midland Wolfcamp A average. And another way to say this is effectively this. Even at Permian-like spacing, we get above average Wolfcamp or above the Wolfcamp A EORs. And so the graph on the right is showing you spacing over time in the dashed line, and it is showing you oil EUR over time in the solid line. And the two things you just really need to notice is the orange line or the red line intersects the blue line below the dashed line, which is showing us Uinta spacing coming in line with Wolfcamp A spacing, but that solid red line remains above the dark blue. And again, just to kind of hammer home the point that we've seen spacing come down, we're getting Permian-like results at full scale Permian-like development patterns. And ultimately that flows through into the economics. So what we're looking at here is nominal IRR by Midland Basin and then county average. And then on the right, showing profitability index as defined by PV15 over CapEx. So basically, is the present value of your cash flows worth more than what you're spending to drill the well? And what you'll notice is kind of twofold. Again, one, the Uinta Lower Green River average, which is the green bar, competes with kind of Midland Ector, Midland Upton County average for Wolfcamp A, but XCL Uteland Butte outcompetes the average and competes kind of more with the Midland Martin County, Midland Howard County stuff in that basin. And so kind of all this to just start drive home the first point, which is the play competes on half cycle metrics, the play competes on full stack development metrics, and the play competes on operational metrics, just like single well IP30, et cetera. And it does that in the context of SM only paying 2.9 times next 12-month EBITDA. And so we really just kind of wanted to paint the picture here of if they did this deal in the Permian, they would have paid quite a bit more, and they would have got a more gassy PDP mix. And so, a comp here that you can do just because it was recent. We looked at the Matador Ameredev deal, which we, again, think was a decent deal. But at the end of the day, XCL, you're getting oilier PDP for less. Ultimately, you're paying more per remaining location for XCL, but you are getting a larger EUR and a larger IP and an oilier type curve. So we think it's justified. And then rotating kind of into the more macro and downstream piece, the point here is really historically the Utah crude benchmark commanded a slight negative differential versus WTI. But in recent years, call it kind of late 2022, we saw that the crude started frequently fetching a quality premium. And then here's where I will caveat this, and kind of really try and paint a very clear picture here of the crude itself receives a slight quality premium, and on a BOE basis, it produces a nice realized price, and it produces a really solid cash margin or netback. We would just probably highlight that on a per barrel basis, the the barrel is still the lowest realized price in SM's portfolio going forward. And the reason we bring that up is kind of this. One, the basin, the Uinta is like at the end of the day, like quite low on GOR. And so making a BOE comparison isn't quite apples to apples. But we kind of just want to follow it up with we think the quality of the type curve itself and the cash flow profile at the end of the day ends up making up for the fact that you are going to receive a lower price per barrel net of transport. And so if you take away anything from that, it's just going to be that, yeah, there's a transport diff. It's not small. It's quite steep. It can be upwards of $12-14 a barrel. At the end of the day, the quality makes up for it, and you can see that in the half cycle metrics. Okay, so tying everything together, there's 4 things to take away from today. I talked quite a bit. There's a lot, that going on, and I said a lot. If you take away anything from today, take away this, especially the first point. We think the basin is roughly 2/3 de-risked. We're still curious to see what happens in the Wasatch, even the Flagstaff Formation, Douglas Creek, which is above that stack. At the end of the day, you're getting Permian-like volumes at Permian-like full-scale development patterns. The SM inventory in the Midland is good, but we still think this is accretive to their position. So they're getting better acreage in the Uinta as far as we're concerned. The operational challenges are receding. So on operating cost, on LOE, getting it to market, production looks good. The oily nature of the BOE kind of makes up for the transport differential. But at the end of the day, like we talked about at the beginning, there was those 4 concerns. They're largely receding. As far as like deal metrics itself, it is oil rich at a reasonable multiple. Again, kind of coming back to that narrative of we went from multi-basin to pure play Permian back to multi-basin. As far as I'm concerned, finding interesting, unique plays like this at a decent multiple is what M&A, Lower 48 M&A probably looks like going forward. And then the 4th point here, and I've called it remaining issues, but I'll kind of rephrase it as just things that we probably would like to know more about. And it wasn't talked about on the call, and I don't believe it was brought up in the deck anywhere, but historically, gas egress has been a concern in the basin. There is not a ton of gas coming out of this basin, but at the end of the day, operators do need to do something with it. And there's still some opacity around that as part of the narrative. And then obviously we talked about the second point here, which is at the end of the day, there's a bit of a steep transport diff. It's the lowest realized price per barrel in SM's portfolio, but the quality of the production itself doesn't in fact balance that out. And you can see it in the half cycle metrics where it competes with kind of higher quality Wolfcamp A in the Midland. And I will leave it there, and I will turn it over to Q&A.
Thanks, Brandon. Looks like we got one in the chat. Do these SHAPS models pull XCL data or all data? Yeah, I can answer that question.
Yeah.
Those models are using data from around the basin, so it's not just a single operator data set. It's basin wide. So Brandon, we have one question in the chat: is water handling an issue for the more conventional Green River and Wasatch? Will water production be an issue?
I can say personally, we've not modeled that out yet, at least not on my side. It's not something that's come up. I think in the context of the Permian and those water issues, I'm gonna say no. But yeah, I would just leave it as it hasn't come up in any of the conversations I've had so far.
Okay, we have another question. What's the ballpark transport diff per barrel from the basin out to P3 or Cushing?
Yeah, so the number I can throw out is that, and it gets a little blended on like what is the heating cost for the tanker. Uh should that be on LOE or should that be on transport diff? And the only number I can throw out just straight out of the Midland deck, or sorry, straight out of the SM acquisition deck, is that I think they're realizing roughly about $78 a barrel in the Midland, and I think that's closer to about 64, 65 in the Uinta. So that there's a $14 diff there. I can't tell you 100% what went into that, but that's the number.
Thanks, Brandon. We have another question here from John Lassick. What impact do you think the upper cube would have? Is there enough Creek results to quantify?
I'm gonna go with no. In terms of like something you'd feel confident extrapolating indefinitely at. I think that last slide where we talked about the summary and we talked about kind of how the 2/3 of the basin uh, are de-risked. I think you get into Douglas Creek, you get into the actual Wasatch itself. That I think that there's still quite a bit of work to be done there, and figuring out what those type curves are going to look like.
Next question we have, any thoughts on supply chain resiliency in the future? Water handling, sand, basin egress via rail or pipeline into the future, labor, etc.
Yeah, I think on that, I'd probably just leave it at um, it's not something we have a ton of visibility into right now, at least, and it's not something we've done a deep dive on. I'd say to date, most of the work that Novi's done has been heavily leaned on subsurface analytics and how it influences production. So I'll probably leave that question
Cool.
there.
Yeah, I think that's good. Next question. The Midland to Uinta comparisons are for SM specific acreage or basins as a whole?
Um, Are you talking about the half cycle metrics here? I think maybe these. So I'll kind of answer this in two parts. These are basin-wide averages for the Midland versus XCL and average Green River. So these are not these Midland half cycle metrics are not limited to SM's acreage. This is just total Midland, Martin County, Wolfcamp A average.
Cool. I think that's good.
Yeah.
Next question from Nick. Any thoughts on implications on emissions intensity for XCL post-merger?
Yeah, I don't. I think yeah, there's tons of stuff in here that's important and probably needs to be done in follow-up analysis. I think for now it's again just we've leaned mostly on subsurface analytics and trying to figure out what leads to production. So
Next question. Do you see takeaway improving materially in the future as the play matures, lowering the diffs?
again, I think it comes back to the kind of opacity on like what is going into that $14 differential per barrel. And I can't say for sure that it can come down. I don't know what portion of that is tolls um versus actual like heating of the crude, etc. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a great answer on that. If diffs will come down over time, I suspect as SM kind of takes over the asset, we'll hopefully we'll get increasing color on what actually goes into that diff. But yeah, for now, I don't have a great answer.
Yeah, sure thing. Any comments on the premiums that operators are getting for waxy crudes? Historically, most oil was shipped to Salt Lake refineries, which were geared for those type of crudes.
Yeah, lots of midstream questions and downstream. I think all I can really say is obviously read the deck when it came out, listened to the earning or listened to the acquisition call, and when I ended up looking through different crude grade price markers, the EIA has a bunch of them. It just synced up with what SM was saying, and they have in recent years started to get a premium. So I can't tell you much on where it's going. At the end of the day, they said it. I fact checked it from a couple different price decks, and it lined up, and that's kind of where we left it. So
Yeah, I think that's good. This is great. We have many questions, so we're gonna try and get to them as many of them as we can. So thanks everyone for your patience here. Next question from John is pore pressure seems to be a dominant variable in well performance. Is there an understanding of what levels of elevated pore pressure can compensate for lower quality rock in the sense of your comments about the Castle Peak interval? I'm happy to take that one. I think I'm not sure I would think of it in terms of pore pressure compensating for lower quality rock. I think pore pressure is just a good thing to have no matter what. And if you can you go back to like the Uteland Butte map with the elevated pore pressure ring there, Brandon? Yeah, I think that's a pretty good one. Pretty good one there. You'll notice here that the orange there would be that's the approximate overpressure cutoff. Some parts of that have good performance, like super excellent rock quality. Some parts have lower rock quality that have higher gas oil ratio. I would direct you to the Urtec paper that we presented that has a little bit more discussion on the pore pressure relationships and the other rock quality metrics for some more there. Okay, we're going to keep rolling here. Logan asks, do you foresee the basin expanding north, a la Douglas Creek past XCL's position slash one south and south, further Uteland Butte, and de-risking in Wasatch tests towards Scout's position? The basin is obviously smaller compared to other plays and curious on overall inventory life.
I think as a rule of thumb for this, it kind of comes back to this slide here um, on the completion intensity over time. As an industry, the basin's effectively just arriving at kind of optimal in the Uteland Butte, which is the core formation. And the point I'm trying to make is I think everything's on the table for coming up the learning curve on other intervals. And I don't have a crystal ball, and I unfortunately can't give you a fantastic answer on it, but um, we have some obviously some wells in the Wasatch. We have some wells in the Castle Peak and the Douglas Creek, and like I would go as far as to say none of them have been catastrophically bad, or very few of them. And so if anything, very directionally, I'd say I have some optimism that there's going to be upside inventory, but yeah, putting a number to it, I don't think we would do that quite yet. But maybe as a follow up to that, the Uinta is on our list, just like if you kind of see our our Midland map here on the left, we are going to generate the same stick by stick inventory that's fully inclusive of rock quality and pressure and spacing for every basin. And so when we do get to the Uinta, we'll have this down, and provided there is a well test in the region, we'll be able to mow the grass and actually put inventory in that kind of follows that. So anyways, all long-winded way of saying, like, we will have Uinta inventory on a granular level as we build it out in the next 6 to 12 months. Here's what we're hoping for.
I'll keep going here. There were a couple questions about specific uh, specific in very specific parts of the basin. We'll kind of apply that same answer. We don't have a take yet on like individual sections or anything yet. But feel free to shoot us an email afterwards for tracking that. Next up here, moving down to the Q&A section, we have one from anonymous attendee asking, how does inventory compare to the Permian? I think that's probably a pretty broad that's a pretty broad question, but on the whole, the rock quality is about as good as the best parts of the Permian in the best parts of the Uinta Basin. And it's certainly a much smaller basin than the Permian, so it's kind of hard to quantify what that total numbers will look like. But given how early it is, but it's a very exciting basin. Next up, we have, does Scout IP date make you rethink that pressure may not be as important as originally thought? Do you know what they're referring to for that, Brandon?
I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly like this, you see this slide here on the Castle Peak, the Uinta has within its stack of rocks, some of them are more conventional, and some of them are more unconventional or hybrids. And I think it's um, from this yeah, from this slide in particular, you can see that the highest rock quality for the Castle Peak is not at the same. Um, okay, thanks. Yeah, we got a little scout drilled
Mm.
some super strong
Yeah.
wells in the GMBU. Yeah, it's not necessarily that the highest overpressure area is the end all be all for all rock quality, and you can certainly, uh, especially in plays that have more of a hybrid or a pseudo conventional component, can get really excellent well results, not necessarily in the most overpressure part of the basin. Next question: how many approximate wells per pad do they drill, and how does that compare to the Permian?
Wells per pad versus the Permian. So was that the question?
Yeah, and maybe also answer maybe wells per unit if you can.
Yeah, so I mean, we Ted and I were looking at a gun barrel the other day, and um, well, I mean, at the end of the day, you can kind of use the interwell per foot spacing metrics, right? So 500-foot interwell spacing in zone. I'll bring that chart up. 500-foot interwell spacing per in zone, and whatever 5,000 feet wide. So they're getting probably in that 8 to 10 range, which again, just kind of what the point we hammered home here, which is you are at the interwell spacing seen in the Midland. So should be
Yeah,
very similar to Midland development in terms of that. That's not true across the board. This is very Uteland Butte heavy. Um, can't can't say for sure that a more geologically heterogeneous interval like the Wasatch would be appropriate to have 8 wells in it. So again, I think you'll just end up with a wine rack that ends up being and like the Permian as well, right? Like you got 3 in the Wasatch, etc. Whatever it ends up being, you got 8 in the Uteland Butte, 3 to 5 in Castle Peak, maybe 2 go in the Mahogany Zone and the Douglas Creek. So again, purely illustrative numbers, but the Permian is developed the exact same way. The intervals that can handle 8 get 8, and the lower quality intervals just don't. So
yep. Thanks, Brandon. I think we got the last one here from Victor Huang. Any geomechanics data brought in for the model? What are your thoughts on whether it will change the SHAP output or move geology data up the impact ladder? Yeah, I think if we brought in more geomechanics data, that might substitute for some of the feature importance that you see from the other variables. But typically, we will see that the geomechanics follows, like the pore pressure gradient, follows and can follow depth or porosity or other pieces of information kind of implicitly. But yeah, we'd love to work more with that. Okay, we're still going here. Next up, who owns the surface land and what is the governmental situations/issues?
I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but that actually SM broke that out in the acquisition deck. And don't quote me on this, but I want to say it was like 70% ish was fee, and the rest was split tribal, federal. But yeah, I would just refer you to that. It's in the deck somewhere for sure.
So next up, actually, it's amazing. Are you guys chatting with each other behind our backs here? We have two questions about stand up versus lay down wells. In other words, north south versus east west. That's not something that we looked at for this paper, this study. I would say that with the right principal stress map, that is something that we could look at to see the difference there for the drilled direction versus the principal stress direction. But yeah, those are good questions. How long are the wells in the basin typically?
Yeah, I
I
think
think
that
they're
these are all
average
two
two
milers.
milers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and they've actually been 2 milers for a much longer amount of time than the Permian on average. Another question here. Can we share the slide deck afterwards? Yes, we'll send out a recording and a slide deck after the presentation to all of the attendees. Okay, I think that's it. Really
Nice.
appreciate everyone's attendance today. Brandon, thank you very much for your presentation here. If anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free to send them to us, to Brandon or myself. And again, thank you for your attendance, and we'll be sending out the materials shortly.